The day Alma Chandler rode into Dusty Creek, Texas, with nothing but a carpetbag, a loaded derringer, and a heart full of stubborn hope, the whole town stopped what it was doing and stared. It was the spring of 1874, and Dusty Creek sat like a forgotten penny on the flat Texas plains, baking under a relentless sun that bleached everything the color of old bone. The main street was a single wide lane of packed red dirt, lined with a general store, a saloon called the Copper Spur, a livery stable, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, and a scattering of wooden buildings that leaned against each other like tired old men. Beyond the town, cattle country stretched in every direction, rolling and golden, stitched together by barbed wire fences that were still a novelty out here, and a cause of more than a few arguments between ranchers. Alma stepped down from the stagecoach and pressed one hand against the small of her back, wincing at the 2 days of road that had rattled through her bones. She was 24 years old, with dark auburn hair pinned carefully under a modest bonnet, and eyes the color of creek water after a storm, that particular shade of gray-green that changed depending on the light. She was not a fragile woman. She had the kind of steadiness in her expression that came from a life that had asked a great deal of her, and received it, willingly or not. She had come to Dusty Creek in answer to an advertisement placed in the San Antonio Gazette by a rancher who needed a schoolteacher. The former teacher, a man by the name of Harlow Gibb, had left town under circumstances the advertisement had described only as a sudden and unavoidable departure, which Alma had found both intriguing and mildly alarming. Still, the pay was fair, and San Antonio had nothing left for her. Her mother had died the previous winter, her father long before that, and the small seamstress shop where she had worked had burned down in February, taking with it the last of her savings and what remained of her certainty about her own future. So she had come to Dusty Creek with her carpetbag and her derringer and her stubborn hope, and she stood now in the dust of the main street, while the stagecoach driver tossed her trunk down from the roof with considerably less care than she would have liked. "That's yours, I reckon," said a voice beside her. She turned. The man standing next to her was tall, broad across the shoulders in that particular way of men who had spent years lifting and hauling and wrestling things that did not want to be wrestled. He wore a battered felt hat the color of tobacco, a blue flannel shirt, and leather chaps over dark trousers. His boots were scuffed to a comfortable shine. He had a face that had seen weather, with a jaw that could have been carved from the same red rock as the Mesa country to the west, and dark eyes that held a quality she could only describe as careful, the way a man looks when he is accustomed to reading landscapes and distances. He was 28 years old, though she did not know that yet. She did not know much about him at all except that he was already reaching down to lift her trunk as though it weighed no more than a saddlebag. "I can manage it," she said, which was not entirely true. "I know you can," he said pleasantly, and picked it up anyway. She blinked. "I beg your pardon." "Paul Finley," he said, extending his right hand after setting the trunk on his shoulder with what appeared to be no effort whatsoever. "I work for the Garrison Ranch. Mr. Garrison sent me to meet the new schoolteacher. You are the schoolteacher, I'm assuming, and not someone who just happened to arrive on the same coach with a trunk that size." "Alma Chandler," she said, shaking his hand. His grip was firm but not crushing, the kind of handshake that communicated respect rather than power. "And yes, I am the schoolteacher." "Good," Paul said. "We've needed one badly. The children in this county have been running half-wild for 4 months, and their mothers are at their wits' end." "What happened to the previous teacher?" Paul Finley's expression shifted into something that was not quite amusement and not quite discomfort but sat somewhere in between. "Mr. Gibb," he said carefully, "made the mistake of cheating at cards with 3 different men in the Copper Spur on the same night. He left town somewhat rapidly the following morning." "I see," Alma said. "And what became of the 3 men he cheated?" "They're still here," Paul said, "and considerably more careful about poker." Alma looked at him for a long moment, and then, despite herself, she smiled. It was a brief thing, that smile, like a match struck in a dark room, but Paul Finley caught it and held it somewhere in his chest without quite knowing he had done so. The Garrison Ranch was 3 miles outside of town, a proper working spread with a big whitewashed house, a bunkhouse, barns, corrals, and enough cattle to make the horizon seem to move when they were all gathered in the south pasture. Thomas Garrison was a square, ruddy man of 50 who ran his ranch with the same no-nonsense efficiency he applied to everything else in his life. His wife, Clara, was a warm, practical woman who had been delighted by the prospect of a female schoolteacher and had already arranged for Alma to board in the small room off the back of the schoolhouse. The schoolhouse itself was the church building in town, scrubbed and rearranged with 4 rows of benches and a proper slate board that Clara had ordered from Dallas. There were 17 children enrolled, ranging in age from 6 to 14, and they arrived on that first Monday morning in various states of grooming and enthusiasm, most of them eyeing Alma with the particular wary assessment that children apply to new authority figures. She had been a teacher in San Antonio for 2 years before the fire, and she knew this moment well. She did not smile too much or try too hard to be liked. She wrote her name on the board in clear, precise letters, set out the primers and arithmetic slates, and told them simply that they were going to work hard but that she was going to work harder, and that anyone who put in genuine effort would find her a fair and patient teacher, and anyone who did not would find her considerably less pleasant. By the end of the first week, she had them. Paul Finley rode past the schoolhouse every Tuesday and Thursday morning on his way to check the northern fence line, and he began to notice, around the 3rd week, that he was allowing his horse to slow somewhat as he passed. He told himself it was because the road was dusty and poor Dandy needed to conserve his pace. He told himself this with the same conviction he brought to other things he believed that were not entirely accurate. The truth was that he liked to hear her voice through the open windows. She had a particular way of explaining things, patient and clear, and occasionally laced with a dry wit that made even the older children laugh, and the sound of it settled something in him that he had not known was unsettled. Paul Finley had grown up in this county. His father had been a rancher who had died of a snakebite when Paul was 16, leaving him a small piece of land that Paul had been working to expand ever since. He had 120 acres of his own now, a modest herd of longhorns, and a house he had built with his own hands that was solid and well-made but empty in a way that had begun to weigh on him more than it used to. He was not a lonely man by temperament, but he was alone in a way that had gradually taken on a particular texture. He had thought about it marriage. Had even courted Mary Dunlap for a season 2 years ago, until it became clear to both of them, kindly and without drama, that what they felt was fondness rather than love, and that fondness was not enough to build a life on. Mary had married a man from Abilene the following spring, and Paul had wished her well and meant it. He was not looking for anything. He told himself this regularly. He stopped telling himself this around the 4th week of Alma Chandler's tenure in Dusty Creek. The occasion was a Saturday afternoon in early May, when Alma had gone to the general store to purchase chalk and writing supplies for the school, and Paul had arrived at the same time to collect a feed order. The store was run by a man named Ezra Potts, who was kind, slightly deaf, and had a tendency to shelve things in places that made no immediate sense. Paul and Alma both ended up in the same narrow aisle at the same time, searching for the same shelf, and when they both reached for the last stick of chalk at precisely the same moment and their hands collided, they both stepped back and said almost simultaneously, "Go ahead." A brief pause. "You first," Paul said. "I genuinely need it more," Alma said. "I have 17 children and 3 stubs of chalk." "Take it," he said, and did not move away immediately as he should have. "How are they coming along, the 17 children?" "Better than I expected," she said honestly. "A few of them are genuinely bright. Tommy Hargrove could be extraordinary if someone fed his curiosity instead of suppressing it. And little Rosie Garrison, Mr. Garrison's youngest, she has a gift for numbers that would shame most grown men in this county. Something in Paul's expression warmed. Tom Garrison will burst a button when you tell him that. I already have, Alma said. He stood up a little straighter, I noticed. Paul laughed. It was a good laugh, uncomplicated and genuine, and it reached all the way to his eyes, and Alma noticed this and then noticed herself noticing it and looked back at the chalk shelf with more focus than chalk strictly warranted. Miss Chandler, Paul said, there's a social at the Garrison Ranch next Saturday. Clara puts one on every spring. Food, music, dancing. The whole county comes. Would you consider coming with me? As an escort, I mean, so you're not arriving on your own. The offer was politely framed, carefully offered, and Alma could see him working to make it seem like a purely practical arrangement, which she found both transparent and endearing. I would like that, she said. Thank you, Mr. Finley. Paul, he said. Alma, she replied. The social at the Garrison Ranch was the social event of the season in Dusty Creek, and it drew people from ranches and homesteads across a 30-mile radius. Long tables were set up in the yard, laden with food that Clara Garrison had been organizing for 2 weeks, and a fiddle player from Sweetwater named Old Pete played reels and waltzes, and the occasional ballad with the kind of easy mastery that made dancing feel inevitable. Paul arrived at the schoolhouse at 6 in the evening to collect Alma, and when she opened the door, he noticed that she had let her hair down, or rather, half down, pinned loosely at the back of her neck with a few strands escaping at her temples. She was wearing a dress of dark blue calico that she had pressed carefully, and she had a small cameo at her throat that had been her mother's. She looked, he thought, like something that belonged to the good parts of the world. He had brought wildflowers, because it had seemed right when he picked them and seemed slightly foolish now, but Alma took them with a genuine pleasure that made the foolishness vanish entirely. I haven't had flowers in a long time, she said, and put them in a tin cup of water by her window with a care that made him understand they were not just flowers to her. They walked the 3 miles to the Garrison Ranch in the long golden light of the Texas evening, and they talked the whole way without once running out of things to say. She told him about San Antonio, about the school there, about her mother and the seamstress shop. He told her about his father's land, about the years he had spent building his herd up from almost nothing, about the way the ranch looked in winter when the blue northers came through and everything turned silver and still. Do you love it? She asked. The land, I mean. Some men work it out of necessity and some out of love, and you can always tell the difference. I love it, he said, without hesitation. There are mornings when the light comes up over the east pasture and the whole world looks like it was made that morning, just for you to walk through. That kind of morning I can't imagine being anywhere else. She was quiet for a moment, and he wondered if he had said too much. But when he looked at her, her expression was not one of polite endurance. It was something more like recognition. My mother used to say that the places that mark us are never the grand ones, she said. She said it was always the small, ordinary ones. The corner of a kitchen, a particular road, a window with a certain view. What marked you? He asked. She thought about it. A cottonwood tree on the edge of San Antonio, she said. On the river. I used to sit there when things were hard and watch the water, and it always helped. I don't know why. She paused. I don't have a cottonwood here. There's one on the eastern edge of my land, Paul said. On the creek. You're welcome to it any time you need it. She looked at him with those gray-green eyes, and something passed between them that was quiet and significant, and that neither of them named yet, because it was too new and too important to rush. The social was everything it should have been. Old Pete played with his customary mastery, the food was extraordinary, and the entire county had come out in their best clothes to eat and talk and dance in the warm May evening. Clara Garrison introduced Alma to approximately 40 people in the first hour, each of whom had something enthusiastic to say about the improvement in their children since Alma had arrived, which Alma received with genuine warmth and the occasional flash of that brief, bright smile. Paul stayed near her for most of the evening, which he did not plan to do but which happened naturally, the way water finds its course. They danced twice, a reel and a waltz, and Paul was a better dancer than she expected, steady and sure, not flashy, just completely reliable, and she found that she liked his hand at her back considerably more than was perhaps prudent after only a few weeks' acquaintance. Around 9 in the evening, a complication arrived in the form of a man named Cole Hatcher. Cole Hatcher was a rancher from the south end of the county, a big, square-jawed man of 35 who wore expensive boots and a silver concho band on his hat, and who had a reputation for getting whatever he wanted, and a corresponding reputation for not taking well to not getting it. He had been the largest landowner in the county until 3 years ago, when the garrison operation had expanded to eclipse him, and the rankling of that had never quite left his manner. He spotted Alma within 10 minutes of his arrival and made his way to her with the focused attention of a man who has already decided the outcome of a situation. "Cole Hatcher," he said, inserting himself into the conversation she was having with Clara Garrison, "and you must be the school teacher." "Alma Chandler," she said, with the particular measured politeness she applied to situations that made her uneasy. "Yes." "You've come a long way from San Antonio," he said, which told her he had already been asking about her and not discreetly. "A woman like you, alone out here, that must be something." "I'm not alone," she said. "I have a whole county of students." Hatcher smiled, but it was the kind of smile that was more about territory than warmth. "I'd like to call on you sometime, Miss Chandler, properly. I have the finest house in this county, and I can offer you considerably more comfort than a room off a schoolhouse." Alma looked at him steadily. "That's very kind," she said, in a tone that communicated clearly that it was not kind at all, it was presumptuous. "But I'm not looking for comfort. I'm looking to do my work well, if you'll excuse me." She turned back to Clara, and Hatcher's smile grew less pleasant by several degrees. He glanced at Paul, who had arrived at Alma's other elbow with the quiet inevitability of someone who had been watching the situation develop. The two men had a history of the ordinary kind, the friction between a large established rancher and a smaller independent one. Nothing dramatic, but nothing warm either. Cole Hatcher looked at Paul Finley standing beside Alma Chandler and read the situation correctly, which did not improve his temper. "Finley," he said. "Hatcher," Paul said. A pause, the kind that held entire conversations in it. Hatcher moved off and Alma exhaled slowly. "Thank you for appearing," she said quietly to Paul. "I was already coming," Paul said. "I just moved faster." She looked up at him, and the candlelight from the paper lanterns Clara had strung across the yard was doing particular things to his face, and she thought with a clarity that startled her that she was in considerable danger of falling in love with this man. She was not sure how she felt about that. She had come to Dusty Creek to work and rebuild, not to complicate her life with feelings. But feelings, as her mother had always said, had very little regard for plans. The weeks that followed were a kind of careful, beautiful negotiation. Paul found reasons to be in town on days that were not Tuesday or Thursday. Alma found herself watching for the particular silhouette of a tall man on a gray horse coming down the main street. They took walks. They had supper at the Garrison house several times, along with other hands and neighbors, which provided the cover of company while allowing them to sit beside each other and talk in low voices about everything and nothing. He brought her to the cottonwood tree one early June evening, just before dusk. His 120 acres lay east of town, the creek running along the eastern edge, and the cottonwood stood where the bank curved, its roots gripping the red earth, its leaves catching the last of the light and turning it silver and gold. It was exactly the kind of tree her mother would have loved. Alma stood under it for a long moment without saying anything, and Paul stood back and let her have the quiet, because he had learned already that she needed silence the way other people needed conversation. "Yes," she said finally, "this one will do." He sat beside her on the bank and they watched the creek move. The sun went down slowly, throwing colors across the water that seemed extravagant, reds and oranges and a deep bruised purple that faded eventually into the deep blue of the Texas night. "Tell me something true," she said. It was something she had started asking him, a habit they had fallen into, some honest thing about themselves that was not shaped for an audience. Paul thought about it. "I am afraid," he said, "that the life I've built is good enough in every practical way and not enough in the only way that matters. That is a very uncomfortable thing to know about yourself." She was quiet. Then she said, "I am afraid that I have been careful for so long, careful not to want too much, careful not to depend on anyone, that I have forgotten how to let someone in, and I do not know if I remember how." They looked at the creek. "We're both afraid of the same thing," Paul said. "That's something, I think." "What is it?" she asked. "Company," he said simply. She reached out and took his hand, just that, just a hand, and he held it without making anything more of it than it was, which was everything. That was the beginning of a summer that Alma would remember for the rest of her life as the time when the world cracked open and became beautiful in a way she had not expected. They rode together on Sunday mornings, when the week was done and the land was quiet. He showed her the county the way he knew it, not the roads and fences but the hidden geography, the dry creek bed where the quail nested, the limestone outcropping on the north ridge where you could see 20 miles in every direction, the draw where the wild plums grew in June and you could fill a hat with them in an hour. She told him stories from her teaching, the small daily dramas and triumphs that she loved, Tommy Hargrove reading a full page without stopping for the first time, and looking up with his face blazing with pride, little Rosie Garrison solving an arithmetic problem that had stumped her brother for a week. He went to her sometimes with practical things, a fence post he needed help thinking through, whether to sell to the Abilene market or wait for better prices, and she gave him her full intelligence without softening it to spare his feelings, which he appreciated more than she knew, because he had spent years being talked around by men who assumed his judgment was final, and there was something extraordinary about a person who would simply tell you what they actually thought. Cole Hatcher was a persistent problem. He had called on Alma twice at the schoolhouse, and twice she had been polite and firm and clear that she was not interested, and twice he had left without making anything of it, but the way he left was not the way of a man who has accepted something. It was the way of a man who is regrouping. In July, things became more complicated. The summer had been dry, drier than usual, and the water rights on the creek that ran along the eastern edge of Paul's land had become a point of contention. The creek ran through Paul's property, but ultimately fed into a larger course that watered 3 other ranches, and the drought had made everyone's tempers short and their calculations precise. There had always been an informal agreement about the water, neighborly and unwritten, the way many things in that county were managed. But Cole Hatcher, whose southern spread was the most affected by the drought, had begun to push against that agreement. He had sent men to dam the creek above Paul's land, diverting more water to his own property, which was both legally questionable and practically devastating. Paul had ridden out one morning to find his creek running at half its usual rate, his stock watering hole barely adequate, and 2 of Hatcher's hired men working with shovels and timber a mile upstream. He had gone to Hatcher directly, which was the right thing to do and also, in retrospect, the kind of right thing that has a cost. "That creek crosses federal survey land before it hits yours," Hatcher had said. "I have every right to manage the water flow on federal land." "You have a right to use it," Paul had said, "not to divert it away from established downstream users." "Establish your claim in writing, then," Hatcher had said, with the smile of a man who knows his opponent does not have the resources for a legal fight. "Otherwise, I suggest you concern yourself with your own property, Finley." Paul had come to the schoolhouse that evening after the children were gone and sat on the step outside while Alma cleaned the slate board. She came out and sat beside him and listened while he laid out the situation. "He is counting on the fact that you cannot afford a lawyer," she said. "I know," Paul said. "He is right about that, too. Are there records, survey documents, original land grants, something that establishes the historical use of that water?" He looked at her. "I don't know." My father never had cause to formalize any of it. Then we need to find out, she said. The county seat is Breckenridge. The land office would have the survey records. And there are statutes. Texas water law goes back to the Republic prior appropriation doctrines. If your family has been using that creek since before Hatcher even owned his land, there may be a legal ground there that doesn't require a full court battle. He stared at her. How do you know about Texas water law? She gave him a look that was dry and slightly amused. My father was a surveyor, she said. Before he died, he used to bring home contracts and documents, and I used to read them because they were the only reading material available. Water rights disputes were extremely common in the years after the Republic became a state. I absorbed a great deal of it. A pause. Also, I read everything. I know you do, Paul said. He was looking at her with an expression she had not quite seen from him before, a sort of wondering recognition as though he was still discovering the dimensions of her. Alma, yes. Would you come with me to Breckenridge to look at the land office records? She thought of the school, the children, the schedule. When? Friday. We could leave at dawn, be there by noon, have the afternoon to search, and ride back Saturday morning. Clara Garrison could manage the older ones for one day, she said, thinking aloud. And I have nothing scheduled for Friday that cannot move. She paused. I will need to bring a chaperone. I will ask Clara. Of course, Paul said, and the look on his face, that particular combination of gratitude and something warmer and more complicated, made her heart do something irregular. Clara Garrison came with them cheerfully, because she had been watching Paul Finley and Alma Chandler all summer with the fond attention of a woman who believes herself an excellent judge of these things and was not wrong. She sat in the back of the wagon and read a seed catalog with the contentment of someone who knows exactly where she is needed. Breckenridge was larger than Dusty Creek, a proper county seat with a brick courthouse, and a land office staffed by a thin, precise man named Mr. Compton, who had the look of someone who has spent his entire life in a room full of documents and had come to prefer it that way. It took 3 hours. Alma and Paul worked through the survey records side by side at a narrow table, she pulling documents with a systematic efficiency, and he reading the land descriptions against his own knowledge of the terrain. They found it mid-afternoon, a notation in the original 1856 survey that established prior riparian use for the properties fed by the Eastern Creek branch, with a list of users that included the name of Paul's father, Jacob Finley, and predated Hatcher's acquisition of his land by 6 years. Alma looked up from the document with a quiet satisfaction that was one of the finest things Paul had ever seen on anyone's face. Prior appropriation, she said. Your family's right to that water was established before he owned a single acre. He cannot legally divert above you. Paul looked at the document for a long moment. Then he looked at her. Thank you, he said. It was 2 words, but the way he said them made them into something much larger, because he meant them for more than just the water rights, and she could hear that, and she did not look away. Clara Garrison turned a page in her seed catalog and permitted herself a small, private smile. They had supper at a boarding house in Breckenridge, a proper meal at a proper table, and something shifted between them over that supper in the way that things shift when 2 people have done something real together and come out on the other side of it. The conversation moved differently, more freely, the spaces between sentences less guarded, laughter coming more easily. Paul walked her to the room she and Clara were sharing at the boarding house, and they stood in the hallway for a moment that extended past its proper length into something else. Alma, he said. Paul, a pause. I want to say something, he said, and I want to say it plainly because I think you deserve plain things. She waited. I have been thinking about you since the first day you stepped off that stagecoach, he said. I have been thinking about you every day since, and not in a general way. I think about what you're reading and what you're thinking about and what your opinion is on things that haven't come up yet. I think about the cottonwood tree and you standing under it. I think about the next time I am going to see you. He paused. I know that you came here for your own reasons and your own life, and I am not asking you to change any of that. But I wanted you to know, because it felt dishonest not to say it." Alma Chandler, who had been careful for so long, stood in that hallway and let herself feel the full weight of what he was saying without immediately building a wall around it. "I think about you too," she said. "I think about you considerably more than is practical for a woman who has a school to run." Something in his whole body loosened with relief. "Good," he said. "That is very good to know." "Don't be smug about it," she said, but she was smiling. "I would never," he said, and he was also smiling. Clara Garrison, behind the closed door of the room, set down her seed catalog and said, quietly and to herself, "Finally." Back in Dusty Creek, Paul presented the survey documents to the county sheriff. A solid, fair man named Sheriff Boone, who examined them, spoke to Hatcher's men directly, and informed Hatcher that he was in violation of established prior appropriation rights and would either restore the creek to its natural course or face legal proceedings at the county level. Hatcher was furious. He made this known in various places and ways, including a long and loud conversation at the Copper Spur Saloon, but in the end he pulled his men back, because Cole Hatcher was many things and a fool was not one of them, and he knew when a legal fight was unwinnable. The water came back to Paul's Creek by the end of the week. August arrived hot and bright and full. The school term was going beautifully. Tommy Hargrove had progressed 2 reading levels in 4 months, and Rosie Garrison could now outperform children 3 years her senior in arithmetic. The county had begun to understand what they had in Alma Chandler, and there were regular small expressions of gratitude: a pie left on her step, firewood stacked without being asked, invitations to suppers and gatherings that told her she was becoming a part of this place. She thought about that, about belonging. She had not belonged anywhere since her mother died, not in a way that felt real and solid beneath her feet. San Antonio had been a city she lived in, not one that held her. But Dusty Creek, with its 17 children and its flat golden plains and the cottonwood tree on the eastern creek, was beginning to feel like something different. Paul came to the schoolhouse one August evening with a proposition. "I want to show you something," he said. "Will you come?" They rode out to his land in the late afternoon, Dandy and the horse she had borrowed from the Garrison stable, and he led her not to the cottonwood or the pastures but to the house. His house. It was small by the standards of places like the Garrison Ranch, 1 story, solidly built of limestone and timber, with a covered porch along the front and windows that looked out over the eastern pasture. Inside it was neat and spare and entirely without ornamentation, a man's house, functional and well-made and quietly waiting for something it did not have. "I built it myself," he said. "It took 2 winters. I wanted it to last." She walked through the 2 rooms, the main room with its fireplace and simple furniture, the bedroom off the back, the small kitchen addition with a proper iron stove. She looked at everything carefully, the way she looked at things that mattered. "It's a good house," she said. "It needs more," he said. "Books, curtains, all the things I have no idea how to choose." A pause. "A woman who knows what she wants and is not afraid to say so." Another pause. "I realize I am being transparent to the point of embarrassment." She turned from the window and looked at him across the room. "Paul Finley," she said, "are you asking me something?" He crossed the room to her. He was not a man who moved impulsively. She knew that about him by now. He was deliberate in the way that deep, still water is deliberate, and when he did something it was because he had thought about it fully. "I am asking you something," he said. "I am asking if you would do me the honor of becoming my wife. I am asking it knowing that you have a life and a work that matters to you, knowing that I am offering not grand comfort, but honest effort and a piece of land that I love and a heart that is entirely yours if you want it." He paused. "I am asking it because I have never in my life wanted anything more than I want to ask it." Alma Chandler looked at this man, this careful, steady, decent man who had picked up her trunk and brought her wildflowers and found her a cottonwood tree and worked 3 hours in a land office to solve a problem that was hers as much as his, and she felt the last of the careful walls she had built around herself become unnecessary. "Yes," she said, "I would be honored." He put his hands on her face and kissed her, gently and completely, and she put her hands against his chest and felt his heart beating hard beneath her palms. And the August light came through the window of the house he had built to last, and everything that had been quiet and waiting woke up. The news of their engagement spread through Dusty Creek with the speed that all significant news traveled in small towns, which is to say it was general knowledge by the following morning. The reactions were uniformly warm, with the exception of Cole Hatcher, whose reaction was not warm at all, but whose opinion had become largely irrelevant to everyone concerned. Clara Garrison organized a celebration supper that grew in scope over the course of a week until it had become, essentially, another social, which was fine because the county liked any excuse for a gathering. There were congratulations and good wishes and practical gifts, things for the house, things for the school, a new primer that one of the ranch families had ordered from Dallas because Tommy Hargrove had gone through the existing one twice. Alma wrote to a cousin in San Antonio, the only family she had left, and received in return a letter full of warm surprise and genuine happiness that made her cry in a good way for the first time in longer than she could remember. She did not give up the school. This had been a conversation she had steeled herself for, because she knew what the expectation was, that a married woman's place was in the home, that teaching was for unmarried women. But Paul had not even paused when the subject came. "Of course you keep the school," he said. "Why would you not? You are the best teacher this county has ever had, and those children need you, and you love it a beat. Besides, I have no intention of telling you what to do. That would be both foolish and ineffective, and I am neither." She had laughed until she had to sit down, and he had looked pleased with himself in the particular way of a man who has successfully made the woman he loves laugh that hard. The wedding was in October, in the church that was also the school, on a Saturday afternoon when the whole county had dressed in its best. Clara Garrison had helped Alma make a dress from ivory lawn fabric that had arrived by freight wagon from Dallas, nothing elaborate but beautifully made, with tucks at the waist and small pearl buttons down the back that had been Alma's mother's. She carried a small bouquet of late wildflowers, the last of the season, because Paul had gotten up at dawn to find them. Sheriff Boone walked her down the aisle, because she had no family nearby, and had asked him with the directness that characterized her, and he had accepted with a solemnity and visible pride that touched everyone present. Paul stood at the front of the church in his best coat, which he had pressed for the first time in probably 2 years, and when he saw her walk through the doors, his face did something entirely unguarded, the face of a man who cannot believe his luck and is not trying to hide it. The minister spoke of the covenant of marriage, of faithfulness and patience and the particular courage required to build a life with another person, and Paul and Alma listened to all of it without fidgeting, because they had both thought hard about exactly these things. When the minister asked if either of them had reason to believe this union should not proceed, Cole Hatcher, who was sitting in the third row, because the county was small enough that leaving him out would have caused more talk than including him, said nothing. He stared at the floor and said nothing, and that was enough. They said their vows clearly and to each other, looking at each other the way people look when they mean every word, and when the minister pronounced them married, the whole church let out a sound that was somewhere between a cheer and a long-held breath finally released. Old Pete had come down from Sweetwater again, and the evening was dancing and food and the particular warmth of a community celebrating one of its own. Paul danced with Alma 3 times, and the third time was a slow waltz, and she put her head against his shoulder, and he held her carefully, as though she was something irreplaceable, which she was. They rode out to his land, to their land in the dark, and the stars were enormous over the Texas plain. The way they get in October when the summer haze is gone and the air has gone dry and clear. She had moved her things into the house the day before, and the books were on the shelf now, and the curtains she had sewn were at the windows, and the place smelled of pine resin and candle wax, and something that was already beginning to be home. He carried her over the threshold, which made her laugh, and set her down inside the warm room, and then they stood there looking at each other in the firelight with the full weight of their whole future in front of them. "Hello, Mrs. Finley," he said, very quietly. "Hello, Mr. Finley," she said. The first winter of their marriage was a good one, despite a blue norther in December that came down from the panhandle and turned the world silver, and still exactly the way Paul had described. And Alma stood at the kitchen window with her hands around a coffee cup and watched it, and felt a satisfaction so complete it was almost startling. The school continued through the winter, and Alma added 2 new students in January, children of a family that had moved in from the east, which brought her enrollment to 19. Tommy Hargrove was now reading books that most adults in the county had not attempted, and Alma had written a letter to the county education board in Breckenridge recommending that certain funds be set aside for advanced students in rural schools, a recommendation she intended to pursue until someone acted on it. Paul had his good seasons and his hard ones, as all ranchers did. The spring calf crop was strong. The summer was dry again, but not as dry as the year before, and the creek held because the diversion was gone and the water ran as it should. He expanded the southern pasture, buying a small parcel from a homesteader who was moving on, and the herd grew to 140 head, which was not vast but was solid and growing. Cole Hatcher remained on the south end of the county, and there was a period of uneasy peace between the 2 operations that eventually settled into simple avoidance. Hatcher had his world and Paul had his, and the country was large enough for both, and over the years even the friction of the water rights dispute faded into the category of history rather than present grievance. In the spring of 1876, Alma told Paul that she was with child. She told him in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning before school because there was no reason to wait for a grand moment, and she had never been a woman who staged things for effect. She simply turned from the stove with the coffee pot and said, "I'm going to need you to take over the morning milking when I get larger because I'm not going to be able to reach the bucket comfortably." He stared at her. She raised an eyebrow. "Alma," he said. "Yes, Paul. Are you saying what I think you are saying?" "I am saying we are having a child," she said, "which will require certain adjustments and a great deal of planning, and I have already started a list." He crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and put his arms around her, coffee pot and all, very carefully, as though she had become something more fragile which she had not, but which she allowed because she understood it was not about fragility but about the fullness of feeling. "When?" he said into her hair. "October, I think," she said. "Dr. Pelham agrees." He pulled back and looked at her face, and she saw in his eyes something she recognized as the same quality she had felt when she first knew she loved him, wonder and certainty at the same time. "Are you happy?" he asked. "Extraordinarily," she said. "Are you?" "I cannot adequately explain to you," he said, "how happy I am." She went back to the stove because the coffee was going to burn, and he stood in the middle of the kitchen for a moment still, gathering himself. And then he went out to start the morning chores with a step that had something different in it, something lighter, as though the ground had changed under his feet. The pregnancy went well. Alma continued teaching through August, when the new term started, and then stepped back and allowed an older girl in the county, one of her best former students, to take the younger children for arithmetic while she managed the reading and writing from a chair at the front of the room, with a composure that made the whole arrangement seem entirely natural. The baby was born in mid-October, a clear, cool morning when the light on the eastern pasture was exactly as Paul had once described, made fresh. It was a boy, solid and loud, with a cap of dark hair that he had from his mother and a jaw that was already recognizably his father's. They named him Jacob Thomas Finley, Jacob for Paul's father and Thomas because Tommy Hargrove had, over 4 years of teaching, become something close to a younger brother to Alma, and she wanted to honor that. Paul held his son for the first time with the careful competence of a man who has held newborn calves and understood the principle, which Alma found both practical and deeply touching. Little Jacob looked up at his father with the unfocused intensity of the newly born, and Paul looked down at him with an expression that bypassed every learned habit of stoicism and simply sat in the open country of love. "He's extraordinary," Paul said. "He is," Alma agreed from the bed, exhausted and luminous. "He looks like you. He has your chin." "God help him," Paul said, and Alma laughed, which hurt, and she laughed anyway. The years that followed were the kind of years that do not make drama but make life. Jacob grew from a sturdy infant into a curious, energetic boy who followed his father across the ranch with a devotion that was sometimes impractical and always touching, and who sat in his mother's school with the focused intensity of a child who has been raised in a house full of books and conversation. Alma continued to teach. The school board, after some resistance that she had addressed with the same systematic patience she brought to everything else, had eventually formalized her position, increasing her salary and providing funding for new materials. The letter to the Breckenridge Education Board had produced results 2 years after it was written, which was 2 years longer than she would have liked but was still a result, and she had used the funds to establish a small library in the schoolhouse, a real one, with 23 books that lived on shelves Paul had built one weekend in November. She also, in the evenings, began to write. Not formally, not with any audience in mind, just the habit of putting things down, observations about the land and the work and the people of the county, small chronicles of ordinary life in the Texas plains in the 1870s. She did not know what she would do with them, if anything. She wrote them because she needed to. In 1878, their daughter was born, Clara Evangeline, named for the woman who had ridden in the back of a wagon to Breckenridge with a seed catalog and a cheerful willingness to be needed. Clara Garrison, for whom the baby was named, cried when she was told, which was one of the few times anyone had seen her do so, and promptly claimed a kind of honorary grandmotherhood over both Finley children that suited everyone involved. Little Clara was dark-haired and keen-eyed, and from her earliest months had an opinion about everything, which Paul accepted with the resigned wonder of a man who understands that certain traits are heritable and that this particular one had not come from his side. "She is going to argue with every teacher she has," he told Alma. "She is going to be extraordinary," Alma said. "The two things are not incompatible." "I know," he said. "I married her mother." The ranch continued to grow. By 1879, Paul had 200 head of cattle, 4 hired men, and a reputation across the county for running a straight and honest operation. He had expanded the house by that point, adding 2 rooms at the back, a proper bedroom for Jacob now that Clara needed the small room, and a study for Alma where her books and her writing desk lived. He had built the study without being asked, because he had watched her work at the kitchen table for years with a determination that moved him, and he thought she deserved a room of her own. She had stood in the doorway of it on the morning he showed it to her, the shelves he had built, the window he had positioned to catch the morning light, the desk that was the right height, and she had turned to him with wet eyes. "You built this," she said. "You needed it," he said. It was the obvious thing. She crossed the room and put her face against his chest and held on, and he held her back, and outside the window the plains were gold and vast in the early light, and the cottonwood on the eastern creek was catching the autumn wind. "I love you," she said into the fabric of his shirt. "I know," he said. "I love you too, in a way that does not diminish but only grows, which I find continues to be the most surprising thing about my life." She pulled back and looked at him. "That is the most romantic thing you have ever said," she told him. "I've been working up to it for 5 years," he said, with perfect seriousness, and she laughed, and Jacob's voice came from outside calling for his father, and Clara's came from her room demanding breakfast, and the morning broke into its ordinary beautiful chaos. There were harder seasons too, because there always are. In 1880, there was a drought that was the worst in memory. 16 weeks without significant rain, the grass burning off the pastures and the creek running low, and the cattle needing to be moved to graze on distances that were nearly impractical. Paul worked from before dawn to after dark for most of the summer, and Alma watched him with a sustained concern that she did not allow to become panic, because panic was not useful, and instead organized the household with a tight efficiency, reducing what could be reduced, preserving what could be preserved, keeping the children occupied and the house a place of calm even when the world outside was dry and anxious. 3 ranches in the county sold out that summer, unable to sustain the losses. Cole Hatcher, to no one's great surprise, bought 2 of them, absorbing the land into his already substantial holdings with the opportunistic patience of a man who had always been willing to wait for misfortune to create opportunity. Paul was offered a sale price for the eastern pasture by Hatcher's agent that Paul turned down without significant deliberation. "He expects you to sell," Alma said the evening after the offer. "I know," Paul said. "What will you do instead?" "Move 30 head to Summer Range in the north where there's still some grass. Take out a short-term note with the Breckenridge Bank against the expected calf crop. Be careful about everything else." A pause. "And wait. A drought ends. This one will too." She looked at him across the kitchen table, both children asleep, the lamp between them. He was tired, genuinely tired, in a way that had settled into his bones over the summer, but under the tiredness there was something unbroken. "All right," she said. "Then we wait." The rains came in late September. Not delicate, hesitant rain, but a proper Texas downpour that went on for 3 days and filled the creek, and turned the pastures from brown to green within 2 weeks. Paul stood on the porch the morning the rain started and put his face up into it and stood there for a long time, not moving, just letting it happen. Alma came and stood beside him. "There it is," she said. "There it is," he agreed. They stood there together in the rain, which was not practical but was necessary, and Jacob came barreling out of the house in his bare feet and ran across the muddy yard with a pure animal joy that made both his parents laugh despite themselves. The drought years had changed a few things in the county. The ranchers who had sold out had moved on, and the land consolidated further, and the small independent operations were under a pressure that would only increase as the decade turned. Paul knew this and thought about it seriously. He had positioned the ranch carefully, kept the debt low, diversified slightly, growing some hay to supplement the range grazing, which gave him a cushion that pure cattle operations lacked. He had also, in 1879, been elected to the County Board of Commissioners, not because he sought it, but because the county needed people on that board who were more interested in fair management than in personal advancement, and enough people recognized that Paul Finley was one of those people. Alma had been surprised and then not surprised. "You will be good at it," she said. "I will try to be," he said, which was his way. She watched him navigate it, the board meetings and the county politics, and the difficult negotiations that came with being one of the few men in the room who was genuinely more interested in the right outcome than the advantageous one. He made enemies of the opportunistic, which was no surprise, and friends of the honest, and the net result was a county that was managed somewhat more fairly than it had been. He brought home the tensions of those meetings sometimes, and she listened to all of it and gave him her honest assessment, and he took it seriously and incorporated it. And she found that this was one of the deepest satisfactions of their life together, not just being loved but being genuinely useful to someone she respected. In 1881, a family named the Red Horse family, a Cherokee family who had come west to homestead after the removal and the hardships that followed, settled on a parcel of land adjacent to the eastern edge of Paul's property. Their arrival was not universally welcomed in the county, which Paul noticed and which Alma noticed, and which they both found unacceptable in the way that certain things become unacceptable when you look at them plainly. The Red Horse family, a man named Daniel and his wife Mary and their 3 children, were attempting to farm the land, which was genuinely hard soil, and they were met with the particular brand of resistance that came from people who had decided in advance that certain others were not entitled to the same chances. 2 of the families adjacent to the Red Horse land had refused to acknowledge them, and there had been an incident at the general store that Ezra Potts, to his credit, had shut down firmly, but which had left a mark. Paul rode over to introduce himself within a week of their arrival, and Alma came with him, and they spent an afternoon with Daniel and Mary Red Horse, drinking coffee and talking about the land and the water and what the soil needed. Daniel Red Horse was a careful, precise man who knew farming the way Paul knew cattle, deeply and practically, and Mary had a quiet warmth and a dry wit that Alma liked immediately. Their children and the Finley children met with the straightforward democracy of childhood, and by the end of the afternoon, Jacob had demonstrated his rope skills to Daniel and Mary's eldest son, and the friendship was established. Paul spoke on the Red Horse family's behalf at the next county board meeting, clearly and directly, establishing their legal right to their land and their access to the county water allotments, and their right to conduct their business in Dusty Creek without interference. There was pushback, not from everyone, but from enough that the meeting was uncomfortable. Paul held his position with the same quality Alma had seen in him from the beginning, the quality of a man who has thought something through and is not going to be moved by discomfort. After the meeting, he told Alma that he thought it had gone as well as could be expected. "You were right," she said. "The law is the law and the right thing is the right thing, and you said so plainly. That matters." "It doesn't fix everything," he said. "No," she agreed, "but it is where you have to start." The Red Horse family stayed and built their farm, and over the years became part of the fabric of the county, the same way everyone else was who stayed long enough and worked hard enough. Daniel Red Horse and Paul Finley became something that was not quite neighbors and not quite friends in the easy casual sense, but something more considered and more durable, a mutual respect between 2 men who had each built something against odds and understood what that required. Mary Red Horse and Alma Chandler Finley became genuine friends, the kind that are made in adulthood and carry a particular weight because they are chosen rather than arrived at by circumstance. They visited on Thursday afternoons when Alma did not have the school board meetings and Mary's youngest was napping, and they talked about books and children and the particular challenges of being women in a world that had not yet fully decided what to do with women who had their own minds about things. The 1880s moved like all decades do, faster in memory than they seemed at the time, marked by particular moments that rose above the general flow. Jacob Finley learned to ride before he was 6 and was so naturally gifted on a horse that even Paul, who had spent his life around horses, was impressed. Clara Finley, at 7, read everything in the schoolhouse library and then asked her mother for more, which Alma provided with a frequency that required a second shelf, and then a third. Little Jacob grew into a boy who was like his father in his love of the land, but like his mother in the precision of his thinking, and who declared at the age of 9 that he intended to run the ranch someday, and also to study engineering, because he had read about the railroads and had ideas about irrigation. "Both," Alma told him. "There is no reason it has to be one thing." "That's what you always say," he said. "Because it is always true," she said. Clara was the talker, the arguer, the child who could not pass an injustice without commenting on it, who at age 8 had written a formal letter to the county school board about the unequal distribution of educational funds between town schools and rural ones, which Alma had read with a combination of parental pride and resigned recognition. "She is going to be either a lawyer or a senator," Paul told Alma. "She is going to be whatever she decides to be," Alma said, "and the world is going to have a difficult time keeping up." In the autumn of 1882, a third child arrived, another boy, born in September with a pair of lungs that announced himself to the entire county. They named him William James, William for Paul's grandfather and James because it was a name they both simply liked, with no particular argument for it other than that it fit. Will was different from his siblings from the start, quieter and more watchful, with the quality of a child who is taking everything in, and has not yet decided what to do with it. He had Paul's dark eyes and something in his expression that was neither Paul nor Alma but entirely himself, which delighted them both. Paul held him the first morning with the ease of a man who had done this before, but the wonder of a man for whom it never stopped being extraordinary. "He looks like himself," Paul said. "He does," Alma agreed. "Good," Paul said. "We already have one of you and one of me. It's good that he gets to be his own." By 1884, the ranch was 260 head. The house had been expanded once more, and Dusty Creek had grown considerably, with a proper hotel and a second dry goods store and a doctor, a young man from Austin named Dr. Harrison, who had married one of the county girls and settled in with the enthusiasm of a man who has found exactly the right place for himself. The school had grown too. Alma now had 26 enrolled students and had proposed and received funding for a second classroom, the school board having finally acknowledged that the county's population was not going to stop growing and that its educational needs had outpaced the original church building. The second classroom was built in the spring of 1884, and Alma hired an assistant teacher, a young woman from Breckenridge named Miss Lane, who was earnest and hardworking and only slightly terrified of Alma, which Alma considered a healthy and appropriate state for a new teacher. She had also, finally, done something with her writing. A man from San Antonio who had come through Dusty Creek on business, a publisher's representative, had stopped at the school to see about a textbook order and had ended up in a 2-hour conversation with Alma, during which she had shown him some of her journals almost as an afterthought because they were on the desk and he had asked about them. He had taken 3 of them back to San Antonio. 6 months later, a letter arrived from the publishing house. They wanted to print them, not as a textbook but as something else, a collection of observations and chronicles of frontier life, written by a woman who lived it. The letter was formal and enthusiastic and entirely unexpected. Alma read it twice at the kitchen table before she spoke. "Paul," she said, he was at the stove. "I have been offered a publishing contract." He turned, looked at her, looked at the letter, back at her. "Of course you have," he said with a conviction that was entirely free of envy or complication. "You should take it." "It is not a large sum of money," she said. "It is not about money," he said. "You wrote those for 10 years, Alma. You should let someone read them." She sat with the letter in her hands and felt the particular satisfaction of a door opening that she had not known she was standing outside. The collection was published in 1885 under the title Plains and People by Alma Finley, formerly Chandler. It was not a bestseller, but it was received with genuine appreciation in the places it reached, reviewed favorably in 2 San Antonio newspapers and 1 Dallas publication, and ordered by 12 school libraries in the state of Texas, which Alma considered the most meaningful measure of its success. A copy lived on the shelf in the Dusty Creek schoolhouse, and when Clara Finley, at age 7, pulled it off the shelf and opened it, she looked at her mother's name on the title page and then at her mother's face and said, with the matter-of-fact confidence of a child who has never doubted the capacities of the people she loves, "I knew you would do this." "Did you?" Alma said. "Yes," Clara said, and put the book back on the shelf and went back to her arithmetic. Paul had bought an extra copy, which he kept on his side of the table by the bed. He had read it twice, and on the second reading had dog-eared 3 pages, and when Alma asked him why those 3, he said that those 3 were the places in the book where she had written something so precisely true that he wanted to be able to find them again. She had asked him what those places said. He had read them to her quietly in the evening, with the lamp between them and the children asleep and the plains dark and vast outside the window, and she had listened to her own words in his voice, and found that they meant more that way than they had when she wrote them alone. The years continued. Seasons came and went, each one carrying its particular gifts and difficulties in the way of seasons. Jacob Finley, at 14, had grown into a young man who was already taller than his father and who worked the ranch with a capability that Paul watched with a pride he kept carefully proportionate, because he did not want to press the boy. Clara was 12 and a force of nature in the classroom, Alma's best student in the way that her own child could not have been otherwise, and also the child most likely to stay up past her bedtime reading by candlelight and least likely to be sorry about it. Will, at 2 and 3 and 4, was the household's heart, the one who brought everyone to the same place with the magnetic innocence of a small child who has not yet learned that people have divisions. He followed Paul in the mornings, and Alma in the afternoons, and Jacob when he could keep up, and Clara read to him every evening in the particular serious manner of a big sister who has decided that her brother's literary education is her personal responsibility. In the evenings, after the children were in bed, Paul and Alma sat on the front porch and looked at the plains, and the years had not diminished this habit but deepened it. They talked less now than they had in those first years when everything was new, not because there was less between them but because there was more, so much more that silence had room in it. He reached over and took her hand the way he had done since that first evening at the creek bank, and she leaned her head on his shoulder the way she had done since the first winter of their marriage, and the cottonwood tree on the eastern creek stood where it always had, and the stars over Texas were as enormous as they had always been, indifferent to years and faithful as anything. One autumn evening in 1886, when the light was doing the particular October thing it does in Texas, going gold and then amber and then the deep burnished copper that only lasts a few minutes and is more beautiful for it, Paul looked at her and said, "Do you remember what you told me when I asked if you were happy?" She thought about it. The morning she had told him about the baby, the one who became Jacob, and he had asked her that. "I said extraordinarily," she said. "Yes," he said. "I want to tell you the same thing now, because I don't think I said it then, I just tried to show it, but I want to say it plainly." A pause. "I am extraordinarily happy, Alma. You have made a life here that is more than I knew how to want before I had it. Every part of it. The children and the school and the books and the ranch and the Thursday afternoons when you are always home by 4 and the way you argue with the county board and the cottonwood and all of it." He paused again. "You." She looked at him in the copper light with the gray-green eyes that had not changed, that still shifted in color with the weather and the mood the way creek water does. "You built me a study," she said. "You needed it. You said that before. It was true before. Paul Finley," she said, 12 years of marriage and you still make my heart do unreasonable things." "Good," he said. "I plan to continue." She put her head back on his shoulder and they sat with the evening, and somewhere on the south pasture one of the cattle called out, and from inside the house Clara's voice rose sharp and quick, correcting something Will had said, and Will's reply came back indignant and incoherent, and Jacob's older brother mediation followed, calm and reasonable, and the sounds of their household came out into the evening air and mixed with the last of the light. The ranch hands had a saying about the Finley place, that it was the kind of spread you could feel before you could see it, that there was something in the air of it that was different from other places, not lucky exactly, not charmed, but settled in a particular way, as though the land knew it was wanted and cared for, and had responded by becoming exactly what its people needed. Daniel Redhorse said something like this once to Paul, standing at the fence line between their properties one morning in the late 1880s, watching the light come up over the eastern ridge. "Your wife built this," he said. "Not just the school and the books, all of it." Paul thought about it. "I'd say we built it together," he said. "She would," Daniel agreed. "But she is also the kind of person who says that about other people's contributions more readily than her own." Paul looked out at the ridge, the land that had been his father's acre and was now theirs, The house with the added rooms and the lit kitchen window, and somewhere inside it the woman who had arrived on a stagecoach with a carpetbag and a derringer and a heart full of stubborn hope. "She is," Paul said. "But so am I, so I know it." The Finley children grew into their own, as children do. Jacob at 15 had the land fully in his hands in the way of a young man who is already becoming what he will be, steady and capable, with his mother's precision and his father's patience. Clara at 13 was the most formidable student in Dusty Creek and had already written to 3 universities in the East to inquire about their positions on the education of women, which the universities had not expected, and which produced at least 2 genuinely surprised responses. Alma had read those responses with the expression of a woman who has raised exactly what she intended to raise and finds the result entirely satisfying. "She will need funding," Paul said. "Yes," Alma agreed. "We will have it," he said, without hesitation, which was the truest thing, because there was not a university in the East that was going to keep Clara Finley from wherever Clara Finley decided to go, and they both knew it. And the funding was a secondary concern to the intention, which was already settled. Will, at 6 and 7 and 8, had grown into the quiet, thoughtful boy he had promised to be, with an interest in plants and growing things that had no immediate obvious origin in his family, but which pleased Daniel Redhorse enormously, who recognized a farmer's mind and spent considerable time introducing Will to the practical science of soil and seed and water. In 1889, Texas was still Texas, vast and complicated, and the decade was changing things. The cattle trails were closing, the railroads were coming through the northern reaches of the county, and the old open-range era was ending with the permanence of barbed wire and permanent fencing. Paul had positioned the ranch for this, had always been running a fenced operation rather than a trail operation, and the transition cost him less than it cost the larger outfits that had to rebuild their entire model. Cole Hatcher had expanded enormously through the drought years and the consolidation years, and now ran one of the largest operations in the county. But he had done it on borrowed capital, and when the cattle market softened in the late 1880s, the debt that had funded his expansion became a problem he could not manage with charm and aggression the way he had managed other problems. By 1889, he had sold 2 of his acquired parcels back to smaller operators, and the third was mortgaged to a Dallas bank that was not sentimental. Paul did not gloat about this. He noted it and moved on, because he had never wanted Hatcher's defeat. He had only wanted his own success, and those were different things. He was 43 in 1889, and he looked it in the best way, the lines of the weather and the work in his face. But his eyes were the same careful, present quality they had always been, and his laugh was still the uncomplicated, genuine thing Alma had first heard in a general store over a stick of chalk. She was 39, and the years had given her a quality that is hard to describe, except to say that it is what happens when a person has lived fully and honestly in a life that fits them, a kind of settled luminousness. Her auburn hair had threads of silver at the temples now, which she wore without apology, and her eyes were exactly the same gray-green they had always been, and when she walked into a room still, people noticed. She was still teaching, which surprised some people and did not surprise anyone who knew her. She had been offered twice, a position in Breckenridge at a larger school with a larger salary, and twice she had declined, because the Dusty Creek School was hers in the way that places become yours when you have built them from the inside out, and she was not done with it. She had published a second book in 1888, a more formal collection, essays on frontier education and the particular challenges and possibilities of rural schooling. It had been reviewed in 4 Texas newspapers and 2 national education journals, and had been requested by the Texas State Board of Education as a reference text, which was more than she had expected and exactly what she had hoped. Paul had taken her out to dinner at the Breckenridge Hotel when the State Board letter arrived, A proper dinner, best clothes, the full ceremony of it, because he believed that certain things deserved to be marked, and this was one of them. "You are becoming," he told her over dinner, "a genuinely important person in the history of Texas education." "That is a very large thing to say," she told him. "You are a very large presence," he said simply. "You have always been. You just didn't know how far it would reach." She looked at him across the white tablecloth and thought, as she had thought 1,000 times in various ways, how thoroughly she loved this man, and how much of what she was had been made possible by the fact of him. Not the dependence, not the need, but the particular freedom that comes from being with someone who has never once asked you to be smaller than you are. "I love you," she said, across the white tablecloth in the Breckenridge Hotel in 1888. "I love you too," he said. "More than the first time I said it and less than the next time I will." They rode home in the dark, the plains silver with a 3/4 moon, the horses steady on the familiar road, and she put her hand through his arm and leaned against his shoulder, and they rode the 15 miles without hurry. In the spring of 1890, Jacob Finley turned 14, tall and capable, and already the rancher he was going to be. Clara was 12, already corresponding with 2 universities. Will was 8, and had planted a garden behind the house that summer that had come up in a way that genuinely impressed Daniel Redhorse, who said the boy had a natural understanding of soil that most farmers took decades to acquire. The ranch was healthy, the school was full, the books were on the shelves, and the cottonwood tree on the eastern creek had grown broad and deep-rooted over the 16 years since Alma had first stood under it, its roots in the red Texas earth, its leaves catching every light. On a Sunday morning in early May, Alma walked out to the cottonwood alone, as she still sometimes did, the way she had come here as a young woman new to this place, when she needed the particular quality of silence that water and shade provide. She sat on the bank of the creek and listened to the water moving over the stones, the same creek, the same sound, though everything else had changed and deepened. The land around her was theirs, hers and Paul's, built year by year, care by care. The house behind her held their children, who were even now probably generating the particular Sunday morning noise that 3 children generate when they have been contained all week by school and chores. The school in town held 29 students and the walls of a second classroom, and a small library that she had built from nothing. She thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach 16 years ago with a carpetbag and a loaded derringer and a heart full of stubborn hope, and what that woman would have made of this morning. She thought she would have wept. She thought she would have understood none of it and all of it at once. She heard Paul coming across the pasture before she saw him, because she knew his step after all these years, the particular quality of it, the weight and the rhythm. He came and sat beside her on the bank without saying anything because he had always been good at the right kind of quiet. After a while he said, "What are you thinking about?" "The stagecoach," she said. "The first day." "That was a good day," he said. "You picked up my trunk." It was the obvious thing to do. She looked at the creek. "I have been thinking about what to do with the next 20 years, she said. "Tell me," he said. "More books," she said. "The third one, I know what it will be now. It's been settling all winter. And Jacob needs to be more involved with the ranch decisions. He's ready for it and you know it. And Clara needs to go east, and we should have the conversation with her properly this summer. Sit down with her and plan it, because she will plan it herself if we don't, and she will plan it into something logistically impossible and entirely necessary." A pause. "And will needs to learn from someone who understands what he has, that gift with growing things. I have been corresponding with a man in Austin who teaches agricultural science, and I think we should bring him out to see Will's garden." She paused. "And I want to go back to San Antonio once with you and the children so they can see where I came from, so they know the whole of it." Paul was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. "All of that, just all right. Is any of it wrong?" She thought about it. "No." "Then all right," he said. "All of it, everything you want, we have time." She turned and looked at him, this man who had said those 3 words, "We have time," with such complete certainty, as though time itself was a thing he had arranged. And she felt the full current of everything, 16 years and 3 children and 2 books and 140,000 mornings, running through her at once. "Paul Finley," she said. "Alma Finley," he said. "I am," she said, "exactly where I want to be." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and the creek moved over its stones in the May morning, and the cottonwood above them was full of new leaves, every one of them alive and turning in the light, and the plains stretched away in every direction, vast and gold, going all the way to the horizon. The Finley ranch stood solid and white in the morning sun, a house built to last, with books on every shelf and curtains at every window, and the sound of children and the evidence of a life lived fully and well in every room. And the 2 people sitting by the creek under the cottonwood tree were the reason for all of it, the beginning of everything, the very center of the whole wide turning world. And they sat there together in the good morning light, as they would on 1,000 mornings to come, for as long as life continued to give them to each other, which was a very long time indeed.